Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another fascinating talk this afternoon about a topic that I personally am looking forward to, and that has to do with the King, Elvis Presley. I'm going to just spend a moment introducing our speaker, and that will let others join in before we actually begin the presentation. So, with that said, my name is Pat Rutledge, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Marco Island Historical Society. We are your hosts this afternoon, and we are delighted to welcome Bob Kealing to the Marco Island Historical Society Virtual Talks series that we have been doing this summer. So, as I said, we're joined this afternoon by Bob for a fascinating look at Elvis Presley's enduring connection to the Sunshine State, commemorating the 70th anniversary of Elvis' landmark 1956 Florida tour. Based on his acclaimed book, Elvis Ignited, this special presentation explores the excitement, controversy, and cultural impact of Elvis' early Florida performances, revealing how the state helped launch his rise to stardom and continued to shape his career as both a singer and an actor. Little bit about Bob. Bob Kealing is the author of 5 books on Florida history and culture and a six-time, say it again, a six-time Emmy Award-winning retired reporter, a 2-time Edward R. Murrow Award recipient, and noted historic preservationist. Keeling has dedicated his career to preserving and sharing Florida's rich cultural history, and for that, sir, we thank you. Before we begin, I just have 2 quick housekeeping notes. Following today's webinar, you'll receive a brief survey from us, and we hope you'll take just a few moments to share your feedback. Your responses are extremely valuable to both the Marco Island Historical Society and Florida Humanities. They help demonstrate the impact of of talks like Florida Talks, supported continued funding, and helped make it possible for us to offer, as we are today, free, high-quality educational programs to audiences both here in Florida and around the world. And if you'd like to revisit today's presentation, Bob has graciously agreed to allow us to have it available on the Marco Island Historical Society YouTube channel. So please, if you'd like to revisit your Elvis experience, take the time to do that or share it with your friends and family. So with that, now we are very pleased to have Bob with us today to take us back to the years when Elvis was igniting stages across Florida and changing American popular culture along the way. So please join me in giving a warm Marco Island Historical Society welcome to Bob Kealing. Welcome, Bob.
Pat, thank you so much. And thank you all for attending today's virtual session. And I will tell you, this talk and so many like it would not be possible without the generosity of our friends at the Florida Humanities. And I just wanted to make a special mention of them celebrating America 250, everlasting Florida. As they say, few states encapsulate the American experiment so vividly as Florida. As we celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding, Florida Humanities is spending the year recognizing the everlasting spirit of Florida, and certainly the legacy of young Elvis is part of that spirit. And this is central to the organization's longest running program, Florida Talks, of which I am very honored to be a speaker. So let's talk about 70 years of Elvis and Florida. And you might all think, well, when I think about Elvis, I think about where? Memphis, Tennessee, or I think about other places in the South. But actually, Elvis spent a great deal of time here. And as you will see, there were other people who were absolutely intrinsic to his rise, to his legacy, who were also here in Florida. And if you take a look at the slide I have up now, it was marking Elvis appearing at the Florida Theater in Jacksonville for 2 shows on the 10th and the 11th of August. So if we just go back a couple of nights, this was the 70th anniversary of Elvis touring Florida, and it was the end of his last 4 tours of Florida in just 15 months. So we started in May of 1955. That was his very first Florida tour. And you might think, well, here we are in Marco Island. I'm sure, he never really got that close to us way down here in Southwest Florida, but actually he did. He came within 60 miles of you all there, appearing in Fort Myers on his very first Florida tour, May 7th through the 10th of 1955. And he was at the very bottom of the bill. He might have come out for just a couple of songs, but already the artists were starting to kind of grumble. Artists like Slim Whitman and Hank Snow, hey, who is this guy? And I'm really sick of trying to follow him with all the girls, screaming and everything. So even then, as a warm-up act, if you will, Elvis was already starting to ignite his career just purely through his charisma and his stage presence. And then if we fast forward now to this, again, this concert bill you're seeing from August 10th and 11th of 56, by that time, 4 tours of Florida, 15 months time, now here in Jacksonville in 56, he's the hottest artist on the planet, which is really an amazing thing to consider. So that's a little bit of the context of it. As we move forward this week in Florida and across the country, Elvis had a double-sided smash single to his credit. And I want to see if you folks in the audience might have a guess as to what it is. The number one song itself on RCA Records was "Don't Be Cruel." However, I would argue that the B side, the lesser side, is actually the more memorable song. And what happened is, so the B side is climbing all the way to number 2 on the charts, and then all of a sudden the A side, "Don't Be Cruel," jumped it to get to number 1, where it stayed ensconced for 7 weeks. So does anybody out there, I don't know if you can unmute your microphones or not, but I'm going to give you a second to see if that's possible. Pat, just so maybe we can just take a couple of guesses here from folks. What do you think that iconic number 2 song was by Elvis that got jumped by the A side of the single, "Don't Be Cruel"? Does anyone out there have any guesses?
How about we put it in the chat? If someone does have a guess, why don't you just type it into the chat for us?
Okay, and Pat, if you'll just read from the chat, and I'll let people know if it's correct or not. Anybody out there have any guesses as to what it would be? And if you don't, that's fine too. I'll be happy to tell you.
Do I get a guess if we don't have any?
That's going to mean you're all stumped. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Pat, do you have any guesses?
Okay, I have, how about Hound Dog?
Oh, I should have known in a crowd of history buffs you'd get it on the very first guess. That is correct.
So thank you, Susan Kenning, for winning the prize. You got the right answer.
And you get the bragging rights too. And this is just a little bit of him. This is him on Ed Sullivan performing that song. To the crazy screams of all the fans and everything. But yeah, this was the song that actually never made it to number 1 because Elvis scooped himself on the charts. So I thought that was kind of a fun factoid. 70 years ago this week, Elvis had already trumped himself to go number 1 with "Don't Be Cruel," bypassing the poor Hound Dog in the process. So yeah, let's talk about what it was like in Florida during that absolutely extraordinary tour, this last one, which took place the first week of August in 1956. Now, what you're seeing on the screen are some of the crowds. And this, on the left, there's this picture of Elvis there up in his dressing room at the Florida Theater in St. Petersburg. And you can see Marianne and Elvis August 7th, 1956. And I had the great pleasure of presenting at the St. Pete Museum of History Friday, which marked 70 years to the day that this took place. And one of the wonderful aspects of it was being there. There were probably about 6 women who were there Friday who had been to one of Elvis's 3 shows there in St. Petersburg. And when I told one of them that, yes, this is 70 years to the day that as a young teen you saw Elvis in St. Pete, and it actually moved her to tears, which I thought was wonderful. So you take a look at the crush of the crowd in the middle. Those poor policemen, look at them. Whatever they were being paid, it surely was not enough. And on the right side of the screen, we have somebody who's joined the fun and activity. Look at that little guy. He's probably in second or third grade. And as the story goes, he had gone all the way up the fire escape at the Florida Theater to get in there. And he looks pretty proud of himself. And I think he's thinking, boy, tomorrow are those third grade girls going to be impressed when I tell them not only did I get in Elvis's dressing room, I actually got to see him. But that gives you a sense of what it was like, just the madness, the maelstrom, everything that was going on all around Elvis's performances. And there's a backstage interview that he did 70 years ago Friday in St. Petersburg. And there's a DJ, and the interview itself is kind of, it's unremarkable except for one part of it. And the DJ is asking him, just how much rest do you get? And Elvis is saying, we have been working so hard, doing sometimes 3, even 4 shows a day, that we're lucky if we even get, I don't know, 3, maybe 4 hours of sleep a night. And look at him. Look at his face. He's only 21 years old at the time, but already just from the frantic, nonstop touring, you can see that he's a tired young man. And it's already been quite a metamorphosis in Florida, along with many other places where he's gone from being the 20-year-old nobody in 1955 to now the 21-year-old king of rock and roll in 1956. And it wasn't like it happened by accident. It happened through a lot of hard work and creativity and his own extraordinary talent. And I also wanted to give you a sense of what it was like for the people who actually saw Elvis on stage. And I wanted to do a quick reading from my book. So this is just some silent video that gives you a look at what young Elvis looked like live on stage 70 years ago. And even his passion during a slow song. So that was a taste of Elvis singing Don't Be Cruel and live on stage. And I wanted to do a reading for you from my book, Elvis Ignited. And what I thought was really interesting was while Elvis was traveling, barnstorming the state of Florida in the summer of 56, doing 7 shows at the Olympia Theater in Miami, and then moving on to go on to Southwest Florida and up the coast, barnstorming at night along the Tamiami Trail, not too far from Marco Island, actually. And as you might imagine, young Elvis driving through the night in his Lincoln Continental or Cadillac, I believe this time he had a Lincoln. I'm sure that's an image that comes to mind. Barnstorming these ghost roads, 441, Tamiami Trail, 1792, US 1. And the thing is, that really happened. That all happened as he was traveling the state of Florida. But he was also traveling with his girlfriend, June Wanico. And she was in the audience and having to sort of try to come to terms with the fact she's trying to have a conventional relationship with Elvis while he is the subject of all of this adulation. And that's what this short reading is about. So now it was the Suncoast's turn. After another group of run of the mill warm up acts, the sleep deprived crowd who had waited for hours in the rain finally got what they were waiting for. He hit St. Petersburg with the effect of a small H bomb, declared writer Ann Rowe, sending fans into mass hysteria. When Elvis appeared on stage in his Kelly green sport coat and dark pants, girls pulled at their hair and shrieked. Boys stared in awe. The green sport coat was his girlfriend June Juanico's favorite. Despite her discomfort with all of the shrieking fans for the man that she loved, she could understand the attraction. He was the most beautiful creature I had ever seen, she said. And I too felt the urge not just to touch him, but to grab bits and pieces of him. I thought that was a very telling passage in terms of what it was like being a woman who's actually dating the young king of rock and roll. So let's pull back a little bit further, shall we? And let's talk about the importance of the state of Florida. And boy, would you look at that young woman on the right. Does somebody have a fan? Maybe can we get her some water? In the middle is one of his playbills from here in Florida, Tampa, August the 5th. And I do want to mention, that's important, Fort Homer Hesterly Armory. That was where Elvis, that's the only venue that he played on every one of his 4 Florida tours. And in a bit, I'll tell you why. Also, you had Lakeland, August the 6th, and we have a little bit about that as well coming up. So Elvis did 59 live shows in the 15 months that I've mentioned between May of 1955 and August of 1956. And believe me, that's more than anywhere in the country. That's more than Tennessee and Texas combined. So you see, this wasn't just some, oh, Elvis played here, et cetera, et cetera. He was here all the time. And why I chose the title of the book, Elvis Ignited, is Florida really did help ignite his career by being his breakout state. He experienced in all of those tours, starting in 55 down there in Southwest Florida and elsewhere, being at the bottom of the bill and then like a rocket ship, thanks to his first album coming out in early 56 and great hits like Heartbreak Hotel. All of a sudden, he's the king of rock and roll. And he played more Florida shows in 56 than in any other state. So Florida was Elvis's breakout state. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, it was 70 years ago this very week that Elvis played 2 nights at also the Florida Theater in Jacksonville. And by that time, there was a certain element of folks, you see this preacher holding the playbill for the shows that Elvis performed. And they were talking about what they thought was a negative influence on young people. And they thought it was unwholesome. They said it was obscene, to the point where the judge in Jacksonville, and I'm sure some of you know this story pretty well, and it is absolutely true, that he said to Elvis, he visited him in his dressing room before he performed. And he said, if there is, I have this signed warrant right here. I have it right here. And should you perform any of your obscene movements, I will serve the warrant and I will walk you personally right across the alleyway to the city jail. So you can imagine how disconcerting that was for Elvis. So he actually got up there on the stage, and when he did Hound Dog, he only wiggled his pinky as a bit of a protest to the judge coming down on him so hard. And for a respectful country boy from Memphis, Tennessee, that was disconcerting that people were saying that he was obscene, because he didn't feel that way at all. What I also want to do is pay tribute and pay homage to the women, the women journalists, the trailblazers here in Florida, who took him seriously. At the time, the men, the male reporters, the crew cut, chain smoking, old school type male reporters were having a really good time calling Elvis a male hoochie coochie dancer, and saying all that was missing was a rhinestone from his navel. And you had people like Ann Rowe who were taking him seriously, and filing real reportage about how respectful he was. And while she was interviewing him in his dressing room, he would actually pick up a broom and sweep up, and he was a very humble young man. Take a look at that right picture there. This is I don't think there's any question that is the most iconic photo of young Elvis that was ever taken. And I don't know if you all were aware. In fact, Pat, if I could, let me ask our friends in the audience, um, does anyone know where that picture on the right, the tonsil photo, was taken?
So if y'all want to put your guesses into chat, I'll be watching for them.
And I'll give you a hint. It was July 31st, 1955, and Elvis is opening up for Deacon Andy Griffith. And you may remember, this goes back a long time, Griffith actually had a hit record, The Football Monologues. And he said, in his funny voice about, them boys, I tell you what, they spent the day kicking this pumpkin all around, kicking the pumpkin all around the field. And the amazing thing was that little pumpkin never busted. And it was very popular, very popular. It was a national sensation, as a matter of fact. And I'm not sure a lot of people know that Andy Griffith was actually a stage actor and a recording star, before he became iconic Sheriff Andy Taylor. Any guesses on where this was taken?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Bob. We don't have any guesses, and I don't have a guess either. So you're going to have to help us out with this.
It's my pleasure. This is another thing that ties Elvis to Florida. This book is the cover of my book. It was taken at the Homer Hester Lee Armory, which is now the Jewish Community Center in Tampa. And it was taken by Red Robertson on July 31st, 1955. And the reason it is so iconic and so important is you see right there in the middle. That is Elvis's very first album that went all the way to #1. And he had been on Sun Records, but his transition to RCA Victor came at a very crucial and important time. And we'll talk about that just in a minute. Here's another trailblazing journalist, Elvis Donaldson of the Lakeland Ledger. And again, while her grizzled male counterparts were, running Elvis down and making fun of him, there was a columnist in the Miami Herald, Herb Rao, who actually belittled all of the girls who had seen, the teens who had seen Elvis during the 7 shows that he performed in the Olympia Theater that week in Miami. And what really amazed me was, at one point, this columnist, Herb Rao, actually said, all these girls with their Presley mania, I think parents ought to slap it right off their kids' faces. Can you imagine putting something like that in print? But Elvis Donaldson did something completely different. She did a week of preview stories on Elvis as a person, as an artist, and really took her job seriously. And as Elvis was going to pull up to the Polk Theater there in Lakeland, she's sitting out in the hot sun with one of those bulky, boxy cameras. And Elvis walks right by her, goes right inside. And so she follows him in there, and she's not particularly happy. And she goes, Elvis, my name is Elvalie Donaldson. I am with the Lakeland Ledger, and I was sitting here to take your picture, and you completely ignored me. And I really don't appreciate that. And Elvis is, inside now. He's making his way up to his dressing room, which you can visit, by the way, in the Polk Theater to this day. And he goes, "Well, I'm sorry, honey. I thought you were just another fan, and my manager always tells me to just, breeze on in and, get in as quickly as possible. So if you need to take a picture, go ahead, shoot." And this was the photo. And there he is, young Elvis, again, looking like it's already been a long tour. And that is another iconic image at the Polk Theater in Lakeland. And while he was doing interviews there, one of the local journalists asked him about Herb Rao and the comments he made. And Pat, I don't know if there's is there any sound coming from there? If not, I'll just explain it.
I'm sorry, Bob, I'm not hearing anything.
That's okay. It basically, what happened was the journalist there asked him about Herb Rao and, belittling his fans. And here's 21-year-old Elvis, and he acquits himself so beautifully. He says, "I don't know who this Herb Rao is, but he's got no business calling these young people idiots. These are kids. These are somebody's decent kids. And if they want to get out and dance and hoot and holler and have a good time, there's nothing wrong with that. While they're young, let them have their fun." And as for somebody like Herb Rao, who's probably so old he can't even get around anymore. Now, I'm not trying to run Mr. Rao down, but yet he's got no business calling those kids idiots. And he really acquitted himself beautifully for being such a young man and already starting to see, the backlash of his fame with folks deciding that maybe his stage movements are obscene. And Elvis just explained it this way. He said, I can't help but move when I hear the music. And, Scotty Moore would say, it helps me with the chord changes when I see him move a certain way. Because, the screaming would be so loud, and this, the stage, the staging was so primitive that a lot of times they couldn't hear themselves. And the Beatles would complain about that too. One of the people I was so fortunate to interview for my book was Governor Bob Graham, or Senator Graham. And it's kind of a funny story. I was working one day as a journalist in Orlando, and I get this call on my cell phone from the 305 area code. I almost didn't answer it because I didn't recognize it, but I did. And there's this voice on the other end going, "Mr. Kealing?" Yes. "Bob Graham. Tell me about Elvis." And I was I was stunned, and I said, "Governor, I was hoping you'd tell me." What had happened was I had found out through a history professor friend of mine that Governor Graham had seen Elvis in one of those shows I mentioned to you at the Olympia Theater in Miami. And that picture there on the left is another iconic Elvis image that has appeared on many covers, Rolling Stone, etc. That was taken at the Olympia in Miami during this August tour of 56. So I said, "Well, Governor, I'd be really interested in knowing, among many things, what you thought about his performance. Did you think it was obscene?" And there was this pause. And then there was this studied voice. If you remember Governor Graham, how he would speak in very measured tones. And he said, "No, I would not consider his performance obscene. However, I would call it provocative." So that is the take of Senator Graham, Governor Graham, on Elvis's performance. He was a 19-year-old freshman at UF when he saw Elvis live in 1956. Another important source to this book was Charlie Louvin, who opened up along with his brother Ira. They were the Louvin brothers, along with Mother Maybelle and the Carter sisters. And some, I mean, you want to talk about an iconic lineup when Elvis was the headliner, traveling certainly through Southwest Florida, up the West Coast during his February tour of 56 in Florida. He had a very interesting take on that gentleman on the left with his very sporty cigarette holder there standing above the king, none other than Colonel Tom Parker. And yeah, Charlie didn't have a lot of good things to say about him. He said, for one, he would schedule shows without even telling us, and sometimes not even compensate for the extra shows that he would schedule. And Charlie's brother Ira got into it with quote unquote the Colonel many times. And I like to tell people, you know, this guy is about as much of a colonel as we all were. In fact, I kind of would prefer to be called general as long as we're giving out these titles. But Parker has just an unbelievable story in Florida. He had been in the military in the 1930s, stationed at Fort Barrancas in the Panhandle. And as legend has it, there was a carnival or a circus passing through, and the belief is that he went AWOL to join the circus and was declared AWOL for a significant period of time. And when he showed back up at the fort, they threw him in the stockade. And if you have ever happened to see, you know, Fort Barrancas there in the hillside in the Florida Panhandle, it is a very austere and I would say scary place. So Parker, the young soldier, the AWOL soldier, not only was thrown in jail, he was thrown in solitary confinement for several months. And by the time he was released from solitary, he was just out of his wits, so out of it that they sent him to a psychiatric hospital where he was officially diagnosed as psychotic. And if you can believe this, after all of that in the 1930s, he managed to make his way down to the Tampa Bay area and got himself a job as the Hillsborough County dog catcher. And, you know, he made his way back as he built his career up and took to referring to himself as a doctor for a while. So yeah, he was quite the character. And the Homer Hesterly Armory is where the good Colonel first started promoting shows. And he had Roy Acuff and Minnie Pearl as his very first show at Homer Hesterly long before he ever became Elvis's manager. And I will tell you also that legend has it that Parker saw Elvis on one of those very early 55 tours here in Florida and decided he wanted to take over his career. And I will tell you, I did get a chance to interview the gentleman who was the radio station manager and promoter of Elvis's show in Ocala on May 10th, 1955. His name is Jim Kirk. And he told me, he goes, that Tom Parker was one unique individual. I've often thought when we were having trouble with the Russians, we should have sent him over there. So Tom Parker made quite the impression. So why don't we talk about a little hidden Elvis history that also took place in Florida? On the left is Mae Axton. She was hired by Tom Parker in 1955 to accompany Elvis as a publicist when he toured Florida. At the time, she was a teacher in Jacksonville, and she she was very ambitious herself. She had some big dreams, and she wanted to be a songwriter. She wanted to be in the music business. And as she's promoting his 55 tour that summer, where I was telling you about that Elvis toured with Andy Griffith, she actually made a pronouncement. She tells Elvis, I am going to write your first million seller. And I'm sure Elvis was like, well, that sounds great, you know. And what happened was, and I'm sure you all have heard bits and pieces of this story. So Tommy Durden, the gentleman in the middle, was a touring musician, and as the story goes, he had had a stopover in Gainesville. He had a gig. The next morning, he's reading the Miami newspaper and reads a little blurb about a gentleman who's apparently thrown himself out of a hotel window. They don't know who he was, and there was just a scrap of paper in his pocket that said, I walk a lonely street. And being a musician, he thought that was an interesting scrap of an idea for a song. And he took it to Mae Axton in Jacksonville, where she lived. And together they penned what indeed did turn out to be Elvis's very first million seller, the number one song that completely changed his career, called Heartbreak Hotel. And I also thought you all might find this interesting, that not only did they write the song, but they actually cut the demo of it in Mae's living room in Jacksonville. And the gentleman you're looking at there, Glenn Reeves, he was a musician, but he was also a DJ up in Jackson. That's where she knew him. And she called him and she asked him to come over and do a demo of the song so Mae could play it for Elvis and he could listen to it and decide if he wanted to record it. And so Glenn did that, and he kind of did a jokey version of the song, but it was actually very similar to the version that Elvis ended up recording. And Mae was able to take it to Elvis to a DJ's convention in Memphis in the fall of 1955. She played him that demo, and he said, Mae, I'll do it. And as the postscript, as Paul Harvey might say, the rest of the story is that Mae felt an obligation to Glenn Reeves for doing them a solid and recording the first ever demo of Heartbreak Hotel in her living room. And she said, I'd like to cut you in 1/3 of writing royalty for the song. How does that sound? And this is obviously before it became a big hit. And Reeves said, oh, why in the world would I want a royalty for a dumb song like that? Sorry, Glenn, you had your chance. A little bit of hidden Elvis history as we wind up my formal presentation, and I'd love to hear your questions, comments, stories, whatever you might have. This was a house in St. Cloud that Elvis actually wanted to buy. Elvis wanted to have a residence here in Florida. This would have been about 1975. And in 606 Sequoia Circle, look at the inside of it, and you see the fireplace there. And I just imagine in the mid 70s, I'll bet it had some really nice green shag carpeting, don't y'all? And Elvis coming down the stairs. And so he wanted to buy this house. And the postscript of the story, according to the Orlando Sentinel, was Elvis wanted to build a theater on the site there, and they told him no. They would not change the zoning. So based on that, they missed their chance to have Elvis in their neighbor, and he never bought. He never came down to live in Florida. Here's a little bit of hidden Elvis history too. Now, I mentioned to you Mae Axton's house. This is it. On the left, 3239 Delwood Avenue, West Jacksonville, not too far from downtown. You know, it's just a very, basic little house, a Florida house that she was living in with her son, Hoyt Axton, who ended up being a successful singer and actor on his own. And this is the house where Heartbreak Hotel was written and the demo was first recorded. And you see the picture of Mae and Elvis. Boy, does he look young there. He probably was about 20 when that picture was taken. And one thing I got a real kick out of is being contacted by the guy who owns the house now. And he said he had read my book and decided he was going to put his own marker up on the house to commemorate the fact that Mae Axton had lived there and that Heartbreak Hotel had been written there. And I will tell you that is the only, whether you want to call it formal, semi-formal, um, uh, plaque memorial that's up so far, at least, for Elvis's extremely historic and important and eventful barnstorming years 55 and 56 in Florida. So there you go, the Mae Axton House in Jacksonville, where Elvis's first million seller was not only written but recorded for the first time. Here's some other good news, but let me not get ahead of myself. So you see Tom Petty here, and what happened with him was his uncle Earl was a prop master for the Elvis movie Follow That Dream, which was filmed just up the coast in Yankee Town and Inglis, and some scenes were shot in Ocala. And Tom Petty grew up in Gainesville, and he said his aunt asked him one day in July of 56, I'm sorry, 1961, if Tommy would like to go meet Elvis in Ocala. And he said, sure. So he and his little cousins got in the car and they drove to downtown Ocala, where Elvis was filming a bank scene for the film Follow That Dream. And Tom Petty tells a very vivid story of seeing the white limousine pull up, and the fans are going crazy. You know, the girls and the police are trying to direct everything. And out walks Elvis. And he said he had a glow about him. And he said, like an angel. And indeed, his Uncle Earl stopped Elvis and said, Elvis, these are my nieces and nephews. And one of them was little Tommy Petty. And I think the rest is history in terms of, I did interview Petty's best friend, Keith Harbin, who was at Petty's house when little Tommy returned from meeting Elvis, and talked about the profound effect it had. And soon he was trading his slingshot for 45 records of Elvis, and the rest is history. On the right, it's a little bit later in 64, and he's wearing his Beatles wig, and Tom Petty was on his own musical journey, which of course led him to be one of the most iconic Florida music legends of all time, now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And you see the title of it there, Tom Petty Historic Marker Vote, because I'm happy to tell you that the city council in Ocala in last December, voted to approve a historic marker in their downtown square to commemorate Tom Petty meeting Elvis and the profound it had, the effect it had on him and on music history. And that is just a wonderful thing. And before I open it up to your questions and comments, I wanted to read you one more little passage about what it was like in St. Petersburg post Elvis, as you know, all the dust was settling and people were trying to figure out, especially the adults, what had just happened there. I hope we never have anything like this again, declared the exasperated Fire Marshal John Gidley. The city newspaper's editorial board took notice of the service of its police force that they provided against the throng of all those charged up teenagers. Quote, these men have faced the toughest criminals, risked their lives in fast automobiles. They've chased burglars across roofs. They've directed parades and demonstrations. But until yesterday, they didn't know what a fellow gets into when he becomes a policeman, the board opined. Thousands of screaming, yelling, laughing, pushing, shoving, hysterical teenagers, mostly girls, gave the policemen a real test. And now that it's over, we'll pit the St. Petersburg police against all odds. So there we are. That is the end of my formal presentation. And I want to thank, again, the Florida Humanities Celebrating America 250. The funding for this Florida Talks program was provided by the Humanities. Any views findings, conclusions, recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the Florida Humanities, but I do want to thank them again for all they have done, and it is a privilege to be part of their Speakers Bureau. And with that, Pat and ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions or comments, I would absolutely love to entertain them. And thank you for your kind attention.
Well, we have a thank you in chat from Kevin Hennessy, who happens to be a board member of the Marco Island Historical Society. So, Kevin, thank you so much for
My
being
pleasure.
part of this program. Um, I have a question, Bob.
Please.
With all of the research that you have done in order to write your book, what stands out the most to you in everything that you've learned about Elvis through that process?
The thing that struck me so much, Pat, was how deeply ingrained his relationship was with the Sunshine State. This was not just something in passing. And as a journalist, as a writer, my priority is always to interview primary source folks who were there, people who experienced it, people like Artis Bell, who actually had Elvis. She and her brother were under the bleachers at the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville, and here comes shirtless Elvis running away from the throng of girls, and he's sitting there eating ice out of an ice box, and Artis gets a picture with him with his shirt off, and it's just one of these wonderful, just little moments of Elvis in Florida. And what struck me was how fortunate we were here in Florida to have such an intimate view of Elvis's ignition into the stratosphere. And we celebrate that. We had him in a film in 1961. We had Frank Sinatra at the Fontainebleau Hotel welcoming him back from the Army in a national broadcast in 1960. We had him on tours in the late 1960s, 69, 70, Curtis Hickson Hall, places like that, 73, 75. And he even toured Florida at the very end in 1977. And, Artis, who I'd mentioned, she saw him in 55. She also saw his last show in Jacksonville in 77. And she said it was sad to see the way he looked, but he never lost his voice. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, we do have another question from Arlene Soldano. Are you an Elvis fan, Bob?
Yes. Yes. I'm so glad you asked that. I'm married to a Memphis girl, and her dad worked at the Cadillac dealership where Elvis would come in as a vampire, after midnight. I'll take two of those. I'll take three of those. And so, yeah, I think it's in my DNA. And I took my family to Key West. We love Key West. It's where my wife and I got engaged and spent our honeymoon. So my daughter and I went out and sang karaoke, and I did have to do some Elvis, which was the song "The Last Farewell" that was made popular by Roger Whittaker. So thanks for the question, and thank you for opening the door to tell that story.
And Paul Flood just wanted you to know that the program was very interesting and really appreciated how much Elvis was liked/loved in Florida. And I would echo that as well.
Yeah, yeah, and he really was an innocent when he got here. And the beginning of the book, let me just give you an example of that. So Mae Axton is there. His first show, by the way, in Florida was May 17th, 1955, and he was the opening act at the Peabody Auditorium in Daytona Beach. And he's staying at a hotel right there down off the beach, and he's standing there at the railing, and Mae Axton happens to encounter him there. And she's just so, hey, Elvis, what you doing? And he's just looking at the ocean, and he says, I just cannot. It's the first time he'd ever seen it. And he's just like, I cannot believe how vast it is. And I just wish my mama and daddy were here to see it with me.
Well, that actually concludes our program. I want to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon. Marco Island Historical Society is very pleased to bring these programs to you, and we will continue to do so. Look for our series that will be coming up in a few more months with more fascinating speakers. So, Bob, it was a wonderful journey with you.
Oh,
And
Pat, what a pleasure. Thank
oh, we're
you.
so grateful. And we hope you can make it down to Marco Island sometime. It would be great to hear more of your stories because I understand you do have them. So we'll have to see if we can get you to come here to visit us.
It would be my pleasure.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.